You know, as a philosopher, you're probably always thinking about the big picture, right? Like the underlying structures that shape our world. Well, today we're going to dig into how feminist philosophers analyze one of the most powerful forces shaping our world today: globalization.
Yeah, for sure. It's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But in this deep dive, we're going to look at it through a specific lens, feminist perspectives on globalization. And we're going to be drawing on that really comprehensive entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
So, yeah, we're not just going to scratch the surface here. We're going to really get into the nitty gritty of how these thinkers break down globalization, especially its economic and political sides.
Exactly. We're going to be focusing on the work of predominantly Western feminist political philosophers, the ones who've really grappled with this topic head on.
And you know that Stanford Encyclopedia entry? It's like super in-depth and authoritative. It covers so much ground.
Totally.
And that's where we come in. We're going to distill all those key arguments and insights, make them clear and accessible for you. By the end of this, you'll have a much deeper, more nuanced understanding of how feminist philosophers critique globalization.
It's going to be like a crash course in feminist critiques of globalization.
Right.
You get the key areas they're concerned about, the different theoretical tools they use to analyze it, and we're going to make sure it's all super clear and insightful. It's something you can actually use to understand the world better.
It's about going beyond the usual talking points and getting to the heart of the philosophical issues at stake.
Okay, so first things first, let's define globalization. In the broadest sense, it's all those economic, social, cultural, and political processes that are bringing the world closer together.
Right, exactly. It's about integration on multiple levels, driven by things like transnational economic production, migration, communications technology, all that.
But feminist philosophers have really honed in on two dimensions in particular, the economic and the political. Yeah, because those are the areas where power dynamics are most evident and where they see gender inequalities playing out in really significant ways.
Okay, so economic globalization. The source material really emphasizes how this exploded in the late 20th century, hand in hand with the rise of neoliberal ideas. Now, for you as a philosopher, the basics of neoliberalism are probably familiar, right? It's about this largely unregulated capitalist economy where individual choice reigns supreme, all in the name of maximizing efficiency, growth, and technological progress.
Right, and it's not just about economics, it's a whole philosophical framework for how society should be organized.
Totally. And it's fascinating to see how those abstract ideas translate into real-world policies, global institutions like the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank, and specific economic policies that have reshaped the global landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the mechanisms through which those abstract ideas become concrete actions with real consequences.
So one key aspect is trade liberalization, right? This is all about those free trade agreements like the USMCA, that new NAFTA deal. They're basically designed to create these huge integrated markets by getting rid of all the barriers to trade between countries.
So that means things like tariffs, those duties and taxes on imports and exports.
Right, but it also includes non-tariff barriers like all those complicated licensing rules, quotas on how much of something can be imported, and subsidies that governments give to local producers to protect them from foreign competition.
The idea is to make trade as free and easy as possible.
But, and here's where the feminist critique comes in, they argue that this often leads to this, like race to the bottom, countries competing to offer the cheapest labor and the weakest environmental regulations to attract those multinational corporations.
And who do you think ends up bearing the brunt of that? It's often women in manufacturing who are already more likely to be in low-paying, precarious jobs.
And it's not just about trade. There's also deregulation, which is basically about easing restrictions on the flow of capital and investment across borders. But it also extends to rolling back regulations that are seen as hindering businesses. And that can include worker protections, consumer safety rules, and environmental regulations.
Right. It's all about making it easier for businesses to operate. And the argument is that this will lead to economic growth that benefits everyone.
But again, feminist philosophers point out that this often means weaker protections for those who are already vulnerable, including women.
Yeah, and then there's privatization, which is all about selling off state-owned enterprises and assets to private investors. This could include anything from banks and major industries to infrastructure like highways and power grids, even essential services like education and healthcare, and natural resources too.
And the logic there is that, the private sector is more efficient, more innovative.
Right. But feminist philosophers raise concerns about how this affects access and affordability, especially for marginalized groups, who might not be able to pay market prices for these essential services.
And then there's the elimination of social welfare programs, which is a huge one. Neoliberalism generally favors shrinking government spending on social safety nets. This could be housing assistance, healthcare, education, unemployment benefits, all the programs that are meant to help people who are struggling.
The argument is that these programs create dependency and disincentivize work, and that the private sector can provide these services more efficiently anyway.
But feminist philosophers point out that these cuts disproportionately harm women, who are more likely to rely on these programs and who often end up taking on additional caregiving burdens when these supports are gone.
Yeah.
And then the source material talks about these structural adjustment policies, or SAPs.
Yeah, SAPs are a big one. These are the conditions that the World Bank and the IMF impose on countries in the global south as a condition for receiving loans.
So they're basically forced to adopt these neoliberal economic policies like cutting social spending, privatizing industries, and deregulating their economies.
And the idea is that this will help them become more competitive in the global market.
But critics, and feminist philosophers are definitely among them, argue that these SAPs often lead to increased poverty, unemployment, and social unrest, which again disproportionately affects women.
It's a very complex and controversial issue, with proponents and critics making strong arguments on both sides.
And then there's the issue of restrictions on immigration, which is kind of ironic, right? Because while capital and goods are flowing more freely across borders, the movement of people is often heavily restricted.
Yeah, and this is where we see the tension between the rhetoric of globalization and the reality of who benefits from it.
So wealthy countries often push for free trade and open markets, but then they put up all these barriers to immigration, which makes it much harder for people from poorer countries to find better opportunities.
Exactly. And this creates a situation where capital can move freely to exploit cheaper labor, but the workers themselves are stuck.
And the source material reminds us that even with these restrictions, migration has actually increased alongside other aspects of globalization. So people are moving, but they're often doing so in precarious and vulnerable ways.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
So proponents of economic globalization often argue that it's been a good thing overall. They point to things like poverty reduction, increased employment, and a higher standard of living in many developing countries.
Yeah, and they argue that the benefits outweigh the costs, and that the problems can be addressed through further reforms and adjustments.
But critics and feminist philosophers are definitely among them, point to the huge inequalities that have been created, that growing gap between the super rich and everyone else.
Right, and they argue that those benefits hasn't been evenly distributed, and that many people, especially women in the global south, have been left behind.
And they also point out that poverty and wealth are not just divided along north-south lines. There are pockets of extreme poverty in wealthy countries and vice versa. It's a much more complex and interconnected system than it might appear at first glance.
It's not just about rich countries versus poor countries. It's about the global system itself and how it distributes power and resources.
Exactly. And feminist philosophers like Jagger argue that globalization actually delivered the opposite of what many had hoped for. They wanted peace, prosperity, social justice, environmental protection, a better world for women.
And instead,
They argue that we've gotten more war, inequality, environmental destruction, and a system that's actually hostile to women.
it's a pretty damning critique.
It is. It's like the very policies that were supposed to bring progress have actually undermined it, at least from a feminist perspective.
Okay, so that's economic globalization. Now let's move on to political globalization, which is closely intertwined with the economic side, but it has its own distinct features.
It's about the shifts in how political power is exercised due to all this increased global interconnectedness. It raises a lot of those big philosophical questions about sovereignty, legitimacy, and the role of the state in a globalized world.
Exactly. It challenges our traditional understanding of how politics works.
The source material contrasts this with the old Westphalian model of international relations, which dominated before World War II. It was very state-centric. So you had these sovereign states, each with a monopoly on power within their own borders.
And there were international treaties, of course, but there was a strong emphasis on non-intervention in the domestic affairs of other states.
Right. So issues like famine or genocide, even though they were horrific, were seen as internal matters for those individual states to deal with.
It wasn't really seen as a matter of global justice.
Right. It was very much a state-focused way of looking at things.
Political globalization, on the other hand, is much more polycentric,
Yeah.
meaning it involves a lot of different actors wielding political power. It's not just states anymore. You have all these non-state institutions operating both above and below the state.
Okay, so globalization from above refers to the rise of all those supranational institutions like the UN, the WTO, the World Health Organization, the EU, NATO, all those big international organizations.
Right, they create rules and regulations that apply to multiple countries.
And sometimes they even have enforcement mechanisms, which can limit the power of individual states.
Exactly, and this is a huge shift from the Westphalian model.
And the source material notes that while some of these institutions, like the UN and the EU, have made efforts to address women's issues, feminist philosophers are often pretty critical of their effectiveness. They argue that these institutions often end up prioritizing the interests of wealthy nations and corporations over the needs of the most vulnerable.
Right, there's a concern that they might not be as impartial or as effective as they claim to be.
And then there's globalization from below, which is kind of the flip side of that.
This is about the rise of all those transnational political movements, NGOs, and social networks, all connected by those global communication technologies we were talking about earlier.
It's like a global civil society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And many feminists see this as a much more promising avenue for change. They see the potential for women and other marginalized groups to connect and organize across borders, to resist those inequalities created by economic globalization, and to push for a more just and equitable world.
So it's like a bottom-up approach to global politics.
Yeah, and the source material talks about these new transnational public spheres, both physical and online, where people can share ideas, mobilize support, and hold leaders accountable.
And they highlight all those transnational feminist networks that have sprung up, focusing on issues like human rights, sex trafficking, labor exploitation, all those issues that transcend national borders.
It's a very different way of thinking about political power in a globalized world.
Okay, so we've got this complex and often contradictory picture of globalization, both economically and politically. So how do feminist philosophers actually approach analyzing it?
Well, the source material outlines a bunch of different theoretical approaches, but they all share some key common features. Think of it as a set of tools that feminist philosophers use to understand and critique globalization, especially how it affects women.
And remember, we're talking about feminist philosophy here, so it's not just about describing the world, it's about changing it.
Exactly. It's about understanding the world in order to make it more just and equitable.
Okay, so what are those common features?
Well, the first one is a focus on understanding the gender injustices associated with globalization.
Which seems pretty obvious, right? I mean, it's feminist philosophy.
Right, but the source emphasizes that they're not just talking about traditional women's issues. They're looking at how gender inequalities play out in all aspects of globalization, even those that might seem gender neutral on the surface.
So things like war, global governance, migration, debt, all of those have gender dimensions that need to be analyzed.
Exactly. And they're not just looking at individual cases of discrimination or violence. They're trying to understand the systematic and structural ways that gender inequalities are built into the global system itself.
Right. So the argument is that globalization, as it's currently structured, is inherently biased against women.
And that this bias plays out in all sorts of ways, from the distribution of wealth and resources to the way that global institutions operate.
So the second common feature is a shared commitment to core feminist values, like equality, democracy, and human rights.
Right, and they use these values to critique neoliberal policies and to advocate for a more just and equitable world.
So, for example, Jagger argues that many of those debt obligations that countries in the global south are saddled with are actually morally illegitimate.
Because the citizens of those countries often had no say in taking on those debts, and they're the ones who end up paying the price.
Exactly. And many feminists use the language of human rights to highlight the gendered harms of globalization.
Even while acknowledging that the human rights framework itself has historically been biased against women.
Right. So they're working within existing frameworks, but they're also trying to transform them from within.
And some feminist philosophers go even further. They argue that we need new feminist ideals altogether, ones that are better suited to addressing the challenges of a globalized world.
Like what?
Well, things like relational understandings of power, collective responsibility, and interdependence.
So it's not just about individual rights and freedoms. It's about recognizing that we're all connected and that we have responsibilities to each other.
Exactly.
The third common feature is an emphasis on feminist methodologies.
Which is basically about how they go about doing their research and analysis.
Right. And the source material highlights three key methodological commitments. The first one is intersectionality.
which is about understanding how different forms of oppression, like gender, race, class, nationality, and so on, intersect and interact.
Right, so it's not just about looking at gender in isolation. You have to understand how it's shaped by all these other factors.
Exactly. And this is especially important in a global context where you have all these different power dynamics at play.
The second commitment is sensitivity to context and concrete specificity.
Which means taking into account the diverse experiences and concerns of women globally.
So it's not about imposing some kind of universal feminist framework on everyone.
Right. You have to be aware of the specific historical, cultural, and economic circumstances of the women you're working with.
And the third commitment is self-reflexive critique, which is basically about being critical of your own assumptions and biases.
Right. It's about recognizing that even feminist theory can be influenced by dominant power structures.
And that it's important to be aware of how your own positionality might shape your research and analysis.
Exactly. It's about being accountable to the women you're working with and to the broader feminist movement.
Okay, so those are the common features. Now, what about the different theoretical approaches?
Well, the source material highlights three main ones: post-colonial and decolonial feminisms, ethics of care, and transnational feminism.
And they each offer a different lens for understanding and critiquing globalization.
Right. So post-colonial and decolonial feminisms are all about analyzing globalization through the lens of Western colonialism and imperialism. They argue that you can't understand the contemporary world without understanding this history.
Right. They say that the legacy of colonialism is still very much alive in the global power structures and economic inequalities we see today.
Exactly. And they're particularly critical of those North-South power dynamics, where wealthy, formerly colonial powers continue to exert influence over developing countries.
And they're also very wary of any kind of universalist claims that come from the West, arguing that these are often just a way of imposing Western values and interests on the rest of the world.
They're really pushing for a more diverse and inclusive understanding of feminism, one that takes into account the experiences and perspectives of women in the Global South.
Okay, and what about ethics of care?
Well, this approach is all about centering the values of care, empathy, and interdependence in our analysis of globalization. They argue that these values have been systematically devalued and ignored by the dominant neoliberal paradigm, which prioritizes individualism, competition, and economic growth above all else.
Right. So they're basically saying that we need to rethink our values if we want to create a more just and sustainable world.
Exactly. And they're not just talking about abstract ideals, they're also looking at the very concrete ways that care work is organized and distributed in a globalized world.
Like those global care chains we were talking about earlier.
Right, where women from poorer countries migrate to wealthier countries to take care of children and the elderly, often leaving their own families behind.
And they point out that this work is often undervalued and underpaid, and that it perpetuates global inequalities.
Exactly. And they argue that we need to start valuing care work more, both economically and socially, if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
And finally, there's transnational feminism,
which is about recognizing that globalization has created both opportunities and challenges for feminist organizing.
On the one hand, it's made it easier for women to connect and organize across borders.
But on the other hand, it's also created new forms of exploitation and oppression.
Right. So transnational feminists are trying to figure out how to navigate this complex landscape and build solidarity among women despite their differences.
Exactly. And they're particularly interested in those specific globalizing processes, like offshore manufacturing, that are creating new forms of gender inequality.
Okay, so those are the theoretical frameworks. Now let's talk about some of the specific issues that feminist philosophers have been grappling with in the context of globalization.
Sure. The source material highlights a bunch of these, but let's focus on four key ones: economic justice, migration, human rights, and democracy and global governance.
Okay, so economic justice, we've already touched on some of this, but it's about how globalization has affected the distribution of wealth and resources.
And feminist philosophers have been particularly concerned about the rise of economic inequality, both within and between countries.
Right. They argue that neoliberal policies have exacerbated those inequalities and that women have been disproportionately affected.
Exactly. They're looking at things like the gender pay gap, the feminization of poverty, and the exploitation of women in global supply chains.
And they're also looking at how those structural adjustment policies we were talking about earlier have impacted women in the global south.
Right. Those policies often lead to cuts in social spending, which can have a devastating impact on women and their families.
And then there's migration, which is another huge issue that's been profoundly shaped by globalization.
Right. Feminist philosophers have been looking at the feminization of migration, the rise of global care chains, and the challenges faced by women who migrate for work or to escape violence and persecution.
And they're also looking at how immigration policies, which are often very gendered and racialized, can create new forms of vulnerability for women.
Exactly. It's a very complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
And then there's human rights, which is kind of the foundation of all this.
Right. Feminist philosophers argue that globalization has had both positive and negative impacts on women's human rights.
On the one hand, it's created new opportunities for advocacy and activism.
And it's led to some important legal and policy changes, like the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW.
But on the other hand, it's also created new forms of exploitation and violence.
Like trafficking, forced labor, and the growth of the global sex trade.
And feminist philosophers are arguing that we need to develop a more robust and comprehensive understanding of human rights, one that takes into account the specific experiences and vulnerabilities of women.
Exactly.
And finally, there's democracy and global governance, which is about how we make decisions and exercise power in a globalized world.
Right. Feminist philosophers have been critical of the way that global institutions like the WTO and the IMF operate.
They argue that these institutions are often undemocratic and unaccountable, and that they tend to prioritize the interests of wealthy nations and corporations over the needs of ordinary people.
And they're also looking at the ways that globalization has affected democracy at the national level, with some arguing that it's led to a decline in state sovereignty and a corresponding erosion of democratic rights.
So it's a very complicated picture with both opportunities and challenges for feminist politics in a globalized world.
Exactly.
So to wrap up, what are the key takeaways from all this?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that feminist perspectives offer a really crucial lens for understanding globalization. They highlight the ways that it's reshaped gender relations and created new forms of inequality, but they also point to the possibilities for resistance and transformation.
Right. And they show us that globalization is not just some neutral economic process. It's deeply political, and it has profound implications for women's lives all over the world. And as a philosopher, I think it's really important to engage with these ideas and to think critically about how we can create a more just and equitable world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just an academic exercise. It's about understanding the world in order to change it.
So what do you think, listener, as we navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected world, what role do you think feminist philosophy can play in shaping a more just and equitable future for all?